Well, hello again, and welcome to the thrilling conclusion of this presentation on Reconstruction. I'm still Mr. Laskowski, your faithful teacher, and the host of this ongoing series, AP United States History, and you. When we last left our story, President Johnson had humiliated himself with his swing around the circle, and now Republicans in Congress were poised to impose their own, much harsher version of Reconstruction. Let's see what happens next. Well, if Lincoln and Johnson's version of Reconstruction had been relatively lenient, that was all about to change when Congress took over Reconstruction. Radicals like this man, Thaddeus Stevens, remember him from the rally a couple of minutes ago, he wanted Southern states to be treated like the conquered provinces that they were and be forced to radically alter their legal, economic, and social structures in order to be recognized, in order to recognize not only the liberty but also the equality of formerly enslaved people. And they had to do all of that if they wanted to get back into the Union as a full state. In the short term, what that meant was dividing the South into five military districts run by martial law and military occupation of all those southern states, except for Tennessee, which had already ratified both the 13th and 14th Amendment at this point. And that's precisely what Congress did. As you see here, the military districts into which the South was divided, Virginia had been so big and had so many people that it got its own district, but we didn't call it Virginia. We called it Military District Number One. And now look at Military District Number Two, which combined North and South Carolina. Oh, how humiliating. Now, the best thing that ever happened to North Carolina was splitting off from South Carolina in 1725, and now here they were, forcibly reunited again. District 3 was basically the SEC football district. District 4 took two terrible states with terrible reputations and combined them into one miserable district, while District 5 took proud Texas and combined it with equally proud Louisiana and just called it number 5. The message here was clear. You are not states anymore, and you won't be until you do exactly what we say. And what did Congress say? Well, first, states had to scrap their old state constitutions, removing any mention of slavery. Then, as if to emphasize that point, states had to write brand new constitutions which ratified the 13th Amendment, outlawing slavery, and then also ratified the 14th Amendment, which was a much more sweeping document. Now, you might be a fan of the First Amendment or the Second Amendment, but it is hard to argue that there's a more significant one than the 14th Amendment. When the Constitution was written, the framers never bothered to even define citizen. They just allowed states to decide that for themselves, which states did, resulting in laws that relegated women, enslaved people, Native Americans, and poor people to the status of something less than a full citizen, sometimes a whole lot less. Well, the 14th Amendment corrected that oversight by explicitly defining citizen for the first time, saying that it included any person, important words there, any person born in the United States who had gone through the naturalization process. Now, being born in the country gave people something that we know as birthright citizenship. And it now means that any person it has full citizenship rights so long as they were born on American soil. Full citizenship rights, regardless of race, regardless of class, regardless of gender, or previous condition as an enslaved person. But you might ask, well, what exactly are those citizenship rights? And here again, the amendment provided an answer. Equal protection under the law. And this means that states couldn't pass laws that were targeted at one race, like the Black Codes, because all citizens enjoyed equal rights and therefore equal protection against those rights being taken away without due process of law. And because all citizens were owed the same procedure, and that's what due process means, then the police or the courts could not use different standards for people of different races. By the way, one of those rights that all citizens have is the right to vote. And so, if states had fully abided by the 14th Amendment, then all citizens, including formerly enslaved people and women, should have been able to vote as soon as the 14th Amendment had been ratified. But that is not how it played out. which is why Congress eventually had to pass the 15th Amendment, guaranteeing voting rights to African American men, and 50 years later, the 19th Amendment, guaranteeing voting rights to women, too. But for now, the 14th Amendment represented a radical change in the social structure of our nation, one that made it a whole lot fairer and a whole lot more equal, at least on paper. Let me mention one more thing about this. At the same time that formerly enslaved people were getting their voting rights for the first time, the Reconstruction Acts also demanded that people who had been Confederate officers and leaders should have their voting rights taken away, as they had engaged in something that might be called a rebellion or insurrection or maybe even treason. So the 14th Amendment represented a big step forward for African Americans and a big step backward for those who had participated in the rebellion. And it was this part of the 14th Amendment that folks tried to use to suggest that maybe President Trump and any politician who might have inspired the violent insurrection at the US Capitol in 2021, or anybody who participated in that violent insurrection, that they should be permanently barred from voting or from holding office. That proposal, it didn't go anywhere, but it does show you the lasting power of the 14th Amendment. So, in the short term, Republicans wanted to find out a way to get rid of President Johnson. And so they laid a trap for him and hoped that he might just be dumb enough or stubborn enough to fall right in. And it was called the Tenure of Office Act. When President Lincoln had been assassinated, most of the people who were his advisors or served in his cabinet, they stayed on. All of them were Republicans. And at first, this helped President Johnson maintain continuity and stability. But pretty soon, it was just awkward to have a Democratic president who opposed Reconstruction and civil rights being advised by a cabinet full of pro-civil rights Republicans. And rumors began to fly that Johnson might just clean house and fire all of his Republican advisors and replace them with Democrats and yes men. And so, in order to protect these cabinet officials, Congress passed the Tenure of Office Act, which stated that the president could not fire officials like this without first getting the approval of the United States Senate, which of course was dominated by Republicans. Well, well, if you remember your Constitution, then you'll be able to see how and why the Tenure of Office Act was designed to insert another step into this process. Because in the Constitution, it says that one of the president's powers is to appoint officials and people to positions of power, including the Supreme Court or ambassadorships or the cabinet. You might also recall that the Senate has a role to play in this hiring process. To protect against abuses of power, the kind that let Emperor Caligula name his horse as a consul in the Roman Senate, the Constitution stated that presidents could appoint officials with the advice and consent of the Senate. And so an appointee would have to appear before the Senate, and so long as they were qualified, the person could take office. It's a check on presidential power, but one that is only used just to make sure that the president doesn't appoint a family member or a particularly delicious plate of spaghetti to a position of power. Once that person is approved, the Senate's role is pretty much done, and the official serves at the pleasure of the president. If the president then decides to fire that official, that's it. The official is fired. Grab your things and get out. Radical Republicans in Congress worried that giving the president such broad firing powers might tempt Johnson to use those powers and just get rid of their Republican friends in the cabinet. So look at what the Tenure of Office Act does. It adds a step to the firing process, requiring the Senate to decide whether to approve or reject the firing of a cabinet official. If the Senate approved, well, then the person was fired. But if it didn't approve, then the person would continue to serve for the rest of the term. That is the tenure during which the president was in office, hence the name of the law. Well, you might wonder, is this constitutional? Maybe so, because Congress deemed it necessary and proper to pass the law. Or maybe not, because it adds to Congress a power that was not specifically stated in the Constitution. I wonder who could answer this question for us. Well, the Supreme Court, of course, but the only way for an issue to appear before the Supreme Court would be if there were a specific case to rule on. And there can only be a specific case to rule on if the president tested this law by firing someone and not requesting senatorial approval. In other words, this was a law aimed at one person, the president, and the only way to determine whether or not it was constitutional would be for the president to break this law and have it decided at the Supreme Court. And so perhaps you can see now how this is actually a trap laid by Congress because they were basically daring Johnson to break the law that he felt was unconstitutional. And Johnson fell right into that trap. And he fell into that trap when he decided to fire Secretary of War Edwin Stanton, a radical Republican who had guided the war effort for Lincoln and then had tracked down the president's assassin and part of that overall plot. Stanton was not willing to go quietly, and so rather than just accept his firing, Stanton physically barricaded himself in his office and he wouldn't come out for weeks. Meanwhile, his Republican friends in Congress were drawing up articles of impeachment against Johnson. Wait, what? Wasn't this case supposed to go to the Supreme Court? Yes, that's what should have happened, but in the minds of Republicans in Congress, the President of the United States, who had sworn an oath to uphold the Constitution and abide by the laws, he had just broken the law. Was it treason? No. Was it bribery? No. Was it a high crime and misdemeanor? Well, to people in Congress, yes. Yes, it was. And so, before anyone knew it, President Johnson had become the first president to be impeached. In all, the House of Representatives issued 11 articles of impeachment against President Johnson. 11 articles. Essentially, all of them are centered around the fact that he had done this one thing, which was trying to fire Edwin Stanton. And so Johnson was impeached for trying to fire Stanton and trying to replace Stanton and trying to evict Stanton for trying to take powers away from Stanton, all in violation of the Tenure of Office Act. And there was one other charge which claimed that during his swing around the circle, the president, and I quote here, quote, did make and declare with a loud voice certain intemperate, inflammatory, and scandalous harangues, and therein utter loud threats and bitter menaces as well against Congress and as the laws of the United States, amid the cries, jeers, and laughter of the multitudes then assembled in hearing. Take note of that phrase, in a loud voice, because it was a coded language message saying Johnson was doing this being publicly drunk. So, firing Edwin Stanton, or at least trying to, making a drunken speech, were any of these things actually high crimes and misdemeanors? Well, that would be something for the United States Senate to determine in a trial. Now, there were 45 Republicans in the Senate at the time, far more than the 36 needed to convict and remove Johnson. If the party had just stuck together, they would have easily won the case. However, quickly things started to fall apart. The sheer number of charges, each essentially restating the other ones, made it seem like the Republicans were trying to spin one action into 11 separate offenses. And then those defending Johnson reminded the senators that the president had violated the act because he thought it was unconstitutional, and that he felt that he was within his rights to have the matter settled by the Supreme Court, not by the Senate. And so one by one, Republicans lost votes until the final tally when 19 voted to acquit and 35 voted to convict. Now, 35 is a lot of votes, but it's one short of the 36 number needed to kick Johnson out of office. And so President Andrew Johnson was acquitted. 88 years later, Senator John F. Kennedy wrote the book Profiles in Courage, in which he described 8 moments in the history of the United States Senate when people took a courageous stand. And one of those chapters was dedicated to Edmund Ross, one of the Republican senators who defied his party and voted to acquit Johnson because he thought it was the right thing to do, even if he paid a political price for it. Kennedy would go on to win the Pulitzer Prize for that book, even though, shh, don't tell anyone, it was mostly written by his speechwriter Ted Sorensen. But that book that he wrote helped to catapult John F. Kennedy into the presidency in the election of 1960. And so, in the end, Andrew Johnson didn't get removed from office, and he did get to serve out the 10 miserable last months of his presidency before going back to Tennessee and dying in disgrace as the first president to be impeached. And he was largely forgotten, but not by the state of North Carolina. In 1948, 80 years after the impeachment trial of Andrew Johnson, the state decided to place this weird statue in front of the state capitol building. Called Presidents North Carolina Gave the Nation, it depicts 3 people who were not actually from North Carolina. They were all actually from Tennessee, and they were also not necessarily worth remembering. Those 3 people were Andrew Jackson, James K. Polk, and yes, Andrew Johnson. Now, in this statue, which you can visit if you go downtown, Jackson was credited with revitalizing American democracy, which, given everything we talked about in Crisis 1 of the Jackson game, is at least arguably true. Polk was credited with enlarging the nation's border, which, due to the Oregon Treaty and the Mexican War, was definitely true. But what about Johnson? He defended the Constitution? Did he? Only if you believe that he was taking a principled stand against Congress when he violated the Tenure of Office Act. But to those who watched in horror as he undermined Reconstruction efforts and then let Southern states essentially deny rights to newly freed people, it's harder to say that he was the defender of the Constitution. But I will let you decide that for yourself. And so we had our first presidential impeachment, which didn't exactly succeed, but Congress was still in charge of rebuilding that American sandcastle. So you have to ask yourself, what were the short-term effects of congressional reconstruction? Well, the first and most obvious is the unbalancing of power between Congress and the president. When Lincoln was alive, the president was at least as powerful as Congress, maybe even a little more powerful. But with impeachment, that balance shifted dramatically in favor of Congress. And it should be said that that scale came one senator's vote against conviction away from having the scale be broken entirely. But this unbalanced scale would stay that way for the next several decades, which is why people don't really remember the presidents of the late 1800s. Hayes? Who? Garfield? Why? Arthur? What? Cleveland? And Harrison. So, Cleveland again. Really? None of these people matter because they were not the ones calling the shots. Congress was. But let's not forget that some of the important work that Congress did during this time, passing and getting ratified 3 constitutional amendments, ones that ended slavery, ones that guaranteed citizenship rights, and one that protected voting rights. Politicians come and go, but those amendments were built to last. And let's also not forget that during this brief time when the Republican Party absolutely dominated the South, admittedly, it only happened because the military occupation, which protected the votes of newly freed people and took away the votes of former rebels, but it was real. And some Northerners came down to profit off of these opportunities in the South that they found by aligning with these occupation Republican state governments. And these are people that were derisively referred to as carpetbaggers coming from the North to profit off of occupation. Or there were also Southerners who did the same, collaborating with these governments and earning an equally derisive nickname, scalawags. But perhaps most remarkably, Black Republicans. which is a term we use to include the formerly enslaved people who were able to run for and win elective office. And here you can see this group of gentlemen who served in Congress during this very brief period. And yet, even as Southern states ratified the three constitutional amendments and held elections, the federal troops did not necessarily leave those states. And the longer they stayed, the more Southerners resisted what they perceived to be an occupation. And some lashed out by organizing politically, and others joined the KKK or organizations like it to resist what they perceived was Northern oppression. And in the middle of all of this, there was a presidential election that needed to be held. Now, to be sure, some states were still what we would call unreconstructed, as they hadn't changed their constitutions or ratified these constitutional amendments. Other states had done so, but federal troops still stuck around to protect the voting rights of newly freed people. But when it came to naming presidential candidates, the two main political parties could not have been moving in more different directions. The Democrats trying to paint the Republicans as too radical, and they trying to appeal to Southerners and poor whites who might have resented all of that civil rights talk, named Horatio Seymour as their nominee. And they doubled down on the white supremacy, arguing, as you can see here, this is a white man's country, let white men rule. By contrast, the Republicans used the old playbook of naming a war hero as their candidate. And in this case, General Ulysses Grant, who had earned distinction not just by winning the war, but also by how humanely and respectfully he had treated the armies that he had defeated. And so when Grant said, let us have peace, hoping to pick up on where Lincoln had left off by binding up the nation's wounds, people tended to believe him. And they elected him president in a landslide. Democrats won some states, sure, and Seymour did get 45% of the total vote, but Grant dominated at the ballot box, just as he had dominated on the battlefield. Now, for all of Grant's conciliatory talk, he quickly found that the problems of Reconstruction were huge and not getting any smaller. Soldiers reported sporadic violence and voter intimidation, both by local officials and by terrorist organizations like the KKK. Clearly, Grant couldn't just end Reconstruction and take troops out of the South, at not least not yet. And this is how we got two big laws passed by Congress. The first, called the Force Act, gave the military the power to continue running elections in the South in order to protect against people who would try to harass voters or rig elections. And the second was the KKK Act, which targeted groups that used violence and intimidation to terrorize the population of newly freed people in the South. And this second act essentially forced the KKK to disband or at least go underground for a couple years. But it would be back because ignorance and extremism are not so easily killed. Now, we tend to think of General Grant, now President Grant, as a generally weak president. But we do need to give him some credit for supporting these pieces of legislation. It's not a lot, but it's not nothing. But also, it wouldn't last. Because even though Grant himself was incredibly popular, the Republican Party brand was hurt by all of the things that happened during Grant's 8 years in office. And there are a lot of reasons why this happened. The first was purely demographic. As Southern states jumped through the hoops necessary to get readmitted into the Union, they tended to elect what we call Redeemer Democrats to government, especially in Congress. These redeemers were unrepentant and unapologetic about the Civil War. And they bought into that whole lost cause narrative that they had been fighting to protect the Southern way of life, and that they expressly supported white supremacist organizations like the White League or the KKK, with the aim of returning things as much as possible to the way things had been before the war. The more people like this ended up in Congress, the weaker the Republicans in Congress were. And so, second, the longer Reconstruction went on, the harder it was to sustain enthusiasm for that. For sustaining Reconstruction. It's kind of like this. Just imagine this entirely hypothetical scenario in which you were to have a teacher who just drones on and on and on and on, all about the same subject. And at some point, you just want it all to end, and you don't care how. You just can't take it anymore. Well, over time, many Northerners, just like that, came to feel a sense of what we call occupation weariness. Oh, just let it end. Just let it end. And some Republicans decided that the radicals had just gone too far in promoting racial equality. And these were people who had supported emancipation and had supported protecting formerly enslaved people from violence, but they didn't truly believe in full racial equality. And this group of people called themselves liberal Republicans, which is really confusing to our ears today. And even more confusing when you realize that this group calling themselves liberal Republicans was actually more conservative than the radical group of Republicans that they were breaking away from. If that doesn't make sense to you, that's okay. But just know that the infighting between liberals and radicals in the Republican Party served further to weaken the overall power of that Republican Party. And finally, but maybe most importantly, what hurt the Republicans the most during the Grant presidency was the series of scandals that were linked to Grant's friends and political allies. Over time, people came to feel that they couldn't trust Republicans anymore, and more broke away from the party. So let's talk a bit more about each of these major scandals of the Grant administration. And as we look at the scandals, consider whether Grant himself was involved or whether it was the people with whom he surrounded himself. Either way, the scandals would diminish Grant's score on the Schlesinger scale of presidential greatness. And there would be so many of these scandals that people would start to refer to the Grant presidency as the era of good stealings. And it starts in 1869 when these men, James Fisk and Jay Gould, men who had made their fortunes in railroads and banking, wanted to compound that wealth by buying up enough of the nation's gold supply that they could essentially control the price of gold, or to use a business term here, they could corner the market in gold. Now, when he had come to office, President Grant had tried to bring down the nation's debt by selling off millions of dollars of gold bars each week, and therefore adding to the profit and adding that profit to the treasury and being able to pay down the debt. But the more gold that was in supply, the lower the price went, and this hurt people who held their wealth in gold. And so Fisk and Gould, they conspired with Abel Corbin, who was President Grant's brother-in-law, to convince Grant to stop selling off that gold. And then during that pause, the conspirators would buy up as much of the gold as was left on the market. And so scarcity ended up driving up the price. The plan worked for a while at least, and in just a couple of days, Fisk and Gould made millions of dollars. But when Grant found out what was happening, he suddenly ordered that the government should sell lots and lots more gold, and that drove down the price of gold because it added to the supply. And so, in the end, Fisk and Gould's plan to corner the market in gold totally failed, and the economy was hurt by these wild price fluctuations. But perhaps most importantly, Grant's reputation was hurt because he had been friendly with people who had tried to use the president's gullibility to enrich themselves. An even larger scandal involved the building of the Transcontinental Railroad. Remember that? As you might know, big government construction projects don't usually use federal employees to complete them. For instance, the folks repairing Interstate 440 or working to complete the 540 loop around Raleigh, they aren't employed by the government directly. They're parts of private construction companies that bid on projects. Essentially, they'll say, I'll build that road for $50 million. And if another company says, I'll build it for $45 million, the government will usually take the lower bid. The company gets the profit, and the government gets its project completed. Well, such was the case in the building of the Transcontinental Railroad, which was at the time the biggest construction project in American history. The companies that bid on these immense jobs stood to make truly ridiculous amounts of money on them, so they weren't above bribing officials and members of Congress to make sure that they won those contracts. And that is what happened here, as people associated with the Union Pacific Railroad bribed several members. I'll say that again, bribed several members of Congress with cash or by offering them kickbacks in order to secure these contracts. And if you don't know, a kickback is what happens when a contract is awarded and then the company then gets that contract where they get the contract and then they secretly send some of that money that they had earned from that contract, kicking it back, if you will, to the very people who gave them the contract in the first place. And sometimes this kickback would take the form of cash payments, or sometimes representatives might receive shares in the company that handled all of the money and financing for the Union Pacific Railroad. It was a company called Credit Mobilier of America, hence the name of the scandal. Well, and in the end, the railroad that they built across the country cost about $50 million to build, but Credit Mobilier ended up charging the government about $94 million, pocketing the extra 44 million in extra money and paying off politicians essentially to look the other way. Lots of people got very, very rich, and when the scandal broke in 1852, the politicians who had profited from it were accused of corruption. I wonder why. The list of corrupt politicians included numerous members of the Republican Party, including leaders of that party, and even Grant's vice president, Schuyler Colfax. Was Grant himself hurt by this scandal? Yeah, not directly, but the Republican Party that he led certainly took a hit. One last big scandal to finish things off, the whiskey ring. You might remember how back in the 1790s, whiskey producers didn't want to pay taxes on their products, and they threatened rebellion against George Washington. Well, we remember how that turned out, and whiskey producers had therefore been quietly paying their taxes ever since. But by the time that Grant was president, they realized that it'd be just a lot easier and cheaper just to bribe the tax collectors. People all the way up the chain of command got paid essentially to look the other way. And when this scandal broke in 1875, Americans were appropriately angry, and they blamed Republicans for appointing these corrupt officials and Republicans who themselves benefited financially from the corruption. And the scandal went all the way up to the White House, where Grant's personal secretary, this man you see here, named Orville Babcock, he was implicated in the kickback scheme. Again, it didn't directly implicate Grant himself, but it clearly suggested that Grant was surrounding himself with very, very bad people. And so all of these scandals really diminished the Republican brand, and they weakened the political power of the Republican Party. So look at this highly scientific chart that I've created. In southern states, conservative, white supremacist Democrat governments were in charge of the immediate during the immediate aftermath of the Civil War, at least in those southern states. That all changed with the Reconstruction Acts, which installed Republican governments protected by the United States military. Over time, though, as states jumped through those hoops necessary to be readmitted into the Union, and acts, events, and scandals that made the Republican Party look too extreme, inept, or corrupt, those Democratic majorities ended up returning to Southern states in the years leading up to the election of 1876. A few states still had federal troops in them, but essentially the Redeemer Southern governments were in charge in these states, and they had a greater voice in Congress. And they thought that they might be able to put a Democrat in the White House for the first time in 16 years. But how would Republicans respond to this? For a while, it looked like President Grant himself might break with tradition and run for a third term as president. And despite all of the scandals, the old war hero himself was still pretty popular. But eventually, Grant did decide to step aside, and this opened the door for one of the most contentious presidential campaigns in American history. The race pitted Rutherford B. Hayes, the governor of Ohio, against Samuel Tilden, the governor of New York. Nominating state governors instead of Washington insiders like senators or representatives shows just how much the scandals had hurt the reputation of Washington politicians. People thought, well, let's get an outsider to come on in here and clean up Washington. And so when the votes were counted in this election, Samuel Tilden was the winner, both in the popular vote and in the Electoral College. All hail President elect Samuel Tilden. But when Republicans, shocked and disbelieving that their party could have actually lost an election, when they began looking around for ways to contest the results of this election, they claimed voter fraud and voter intimidation, especially in the South, where members of the military in places like Louisiana, South Carolina, and Florida reported widespread efforts to threaten and terrorize black voters or just rig the election results. Republicans figured if the results in those states couldn't be trusted, maybe Democrats shouldn't be rewarded with their electoral votes. And so a plan was hatched, a plan that would contest the results in those three states and flip them to the Republicans. And then, for good measure, take one electoral vote that the Democrats had won in Oregon. And then, if they did that, Hayes could get those 20 new electoral votes, adding to his total, bringing it to 185, while Tilden would lose those 20 electoral votes and end up with 184. Doing this would make Hayes the winner by one electoral vote. And if it sounds like the Republicans are trying to steal an election that they lost, it's because that's exactly what was happening here. To be sure, there had been voter suppression and intimidation in those three southern states, which is why the Republicans would cry foul. But Democrats did essentially say, scoreboard, and also claimed victory in this election. And so, in a scene mildly reminiscent of the 2020 election, when the losing candidate claimed victory and then tried to figure out a way to flip the election, the Republican Party in 1876 insisted that those 20 electoral votes belonged in Hayes's column, and they insisted on a full investigation. With Inauguration Day quickly approaching and both sides claiming victory, Congress agreed to create an election commission, one that would look at the issue fairly and decide the issue finally. It would be made up of 7 Republican politicians and judges, and 7 Democratic politicians and judges, and then one truly independent judge. And everyone thought that this was a perfectly fair solution until that independent judge resigned and was replaced by a Republican. And so I wish I could say that the 15 appointees looked carefully at the facts and rendered a sober decision. But I can't say that in all honesty. In the end, the 8 Republican appointees decided that Hayes should get all 20 of those electoral votes, and the 7 Democratic appointees thought that Tilden should get all 20 electoral votes. And now Congress had to decide whether or not to accept the decision of this election commission. And again, Inauguration Day got closer and closer and closer. So, how would this thing finally be resolved? Well, it would be resolved with that most American of solutions, compromise. In secret negotiations in a Washington hotel room, Republicans and Democrats hammered out a solution. And in the end, Republicans got what they wanted most, which was for Hayes to get those 20 electoral votes and be named president. Democrats, however, got something far more important to them. They received a commitment that those last troops would be removed from southern states, essentially ending Reconstruction. And because southern states would be allowed to pretty much run their states however they chose, they quickly moved to secure power for these redeemer governments dominated by white conservative Democrats. And doing so essentially ran Republicans out of the South. And it led to Jim Crow laws and the systematic disenfranchisement of all African Americans in the South, and it turned the former Confederate states into something that was called the Solid South. Solidly, reliably democratic, white supremacist governments that would control politics in the region for the next 90 years. So, who got the better deal in the Compromise of 1877? Was it the Republicans who got the presidency, or was it the Democrats who got the end of Reconstruction and control of the South for a century? I'll allow you to draw your own conclusions, but I'll also say that you now possess almost all of the information you might need to answer one of the single most important questions in American history, one that would make for an excellent prompt on a long essay for a future test. Assess the validity of the following statement. The North won the war, but the South won Reconstruction. And by now, you probably already know the answer to this question. It's complicated, but responding to this prompt, whether in question form or not, requires us to focus not just on the short term results of a presidential election, but on the long term effects of the decision to end Reconstruction. So, the first factor to consider is people's attitudes about government. Military occupation and the corruption that was exposed during the Grant administration led many people to wonder if big national government was the solution to the problem or the problem itself. And so power reverted back to the states for really the next several decades, something which surely would have pleased old believers in a decentralized kind of a government, people who had supported the Confederacy. And the fact that the states were left to their own devices after Reconstruction meant that, as I mentioned earlier, Democratic governments were able to dominate Republicans for nearly a century, turning the region into what we called the Solid South, and it could always be counted on to support Democrats and to oppose integration or citizenship rights for African Americans. And that's something that wouldn't change until the modern civil rights movement. And while some parts of the South embraced industry and development and built what was called the New South, much of the region reverted to agricultural production. Wealthy landowners, now faced with having to pay their employees, figured out a way to keep their workers impoverished and subservient. It was called the crop lien system, and it meant that agricultural employees would live and work on land that they did not own, exchanging their labor for rent and food and supplies. This system ensured that sharecroppers, as they would be called, both white and black, would rarely, if ever, reap any real profit from their labors. And despite the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, protections against being denied the right to vote on the basis of race, Southern states did still find a way, they found diabolical ways to deny African Americans their right to vote. They passed laws requiring certain people to pay poll taxes in order to vote. And so sharecroppers who had hardly any money at all could not possibly afford to do this, and so they ended up not being able to vote. Or states required literacy tests in order to vote. Not can you read and write literacy tests, but rather can you recite Article 3 of the Constitution from memory kind of literacy tests. In other words, a test that no person could really pass. Poor white people were often exempted from these tests because of what we called grandfather clauses, which stated that taxes and tests could only be applied to people whose grandfathers could not vote in 1860, which was essentially all formerly enslaved people. And the result of these social, political, and economic consequences was that white supremacist governments in the South were able to create an entirely two tiered social system through the passage of what came to be known as Jim Crow laws. These laws enforced the complete segregation of the races, and they claimed that they weren't violating the 14th Amendment of equal protection because the facilities and services provided were, quote, separate but equal. And we'll learn more about that in future lessons. But by now, you should be able to write a pretty effective response to that prompt about whether or not the South won Reconstruction. And so for now, let me take this opportunity to thank you for joining me on our journey through Reconstruction. I hope you took great notes, and I will see you on the other side of the screen.